Hello, and welcome to another episode of Essential Dialogues with Teddy Allen. I'm so glad that you chose to watch this episode. Please subscribe, like, and share. Thank you so much. Today's guest is an incredible man. He's a believer in Jesus Christ, and he's also an author, an elder. He's a father, a husband. And as a believer in Jesus Christ, what makes him so special, particularly for today's episode, is that he has chosen to share his testimony of the spiritual struggle between good and evil. Matter of fact, he's even written a book about it. Our special guest today is Nathaniel Arnold, and we're going to discuss his book, My Story, His Glory. To get it started, I asked him why he chose to write this book, why now, and what the intent of the book is. So we're going to bring you to our recording of this interview. We recorded it in the sanctuary of the Capitol Hill Seventh-day Adventist Church. With no further ado, join us for this interview with Nathaniel Arnold.
The reality of it was, for me, I was going through a life crisis. The name of the book, by the way, is My Story, His Glory. And Ulysses, my brother, had just passed about 5 months before. And 5 months later, after his death, I was diagnosed with cancer for the second time in my adult life. And so I was going through a crisis, a physical crisis, a crisis of faith, so to speak. And so this one particular morning, weekday morning, I was wondering and asking God what was going on. I felt I was doing everything that I was supposed to be doing. I was attending church regularly. I was an elder, am an elder at Capitol Hill Church. And so once I was diagnosed, this one particular morning, I got in my car and I drove to Fort Washington Park. There's a beautiful scenic vista right at the park, and you can see Virginia from where I was sitting. And it was a misty rain falling. And as the rain was falling, I was praying, asking God, do you love me? Do I have to go through this? I didn't, cancer's a serious diagnosis.
Right.
And as I was sitting in my car, watching the windshield wipers go back and forth, I heard this still small voice speak to me. And he says simply this: you will write a book. And I was puzzled because I had heard God's voice before, but this was not this kind of circumstance answer I was expecting.
Sure.
And so I questioned. I said, write a book, and I said, about what? Really, I was just confused. And the moment that those words got out of my head, I got a call.
A phone call.
A phone
while
call.
While you're sitting in the car.
While I'm sitting in the car with the rain, the misty rain falling. And it was from a woman here at church. Could I mention her name, or should I?
Sure.
Okay. She was on the prayer line with me. Her name is Brita Hines.
Yeah, this is a tell-all interview. So, all right.
Great. I'm not going to tell all, though. And so she called me and she said, Nate, I was remembering what you said on the prayer line. And she said, have you ever thought about writing a book?
Right at the same time that you're
Right at the same time I'm asking God about, this book suggestion. And so I was amazed. I was like, wow, that was God, because that's right on time. But before Brita could actually hang up, we were still talking, I got another ring on my phone. And this time the name popped up was my oldest daughter, Alexandra Arnold, Lexi. And so I thought, this is very unusual because she never calls me this early in the morning. And so I told Brita I had to, to hang up and take this call. I took the call and I asked Lexi, what's wrong? What's the problem? And she said, Dad, she said, you know, you were talking at Vespers about Dr. Sabi and Nipsey Hussle. And she said, you just have such a wealth of experience. You should write a book.
Wow.
Isn't that amazing?
Double confirmation.
Double confirmation. So within that brief span of a minute, the Holy Spirit breathed and I'm my daughter. So I had confirmation 3 times.
So what's the intent of the book?
That's a good question. And the intent, I think, to a large degree, I'm still learning, but the intent of any testimony, because the book is truly my testimony of how the Lord brought me through so many dead ends, so many misdirections, so many deceptions, to tell people what he's done for me personally, not that I read about, not something that I thought about, but what God has brought me through to help other people in the same situations that I found myself in.
Amen. So let's jump straight to it, straight to your life story for his glory. You were born and raised in Mobile, Alabama.
That's right, that's right.
Race, bigotry, prejudice, and religion appear to have impacted your life from an early age. Can you speak to some of
Very
that?
much so, very much so. I come from a background, a large family. My grandfather was an itinerant preacher. And so we grew up in a religious household. And so my earliest recollections of 2 things, of church and of racism. And I've got a lot of stories, and I chronicle them in the book as well.
Right.
But one of the most seminal stories is when I was about 7 years old, and I was addicted to television, especially the news at that age. And I wasn't quite 7, and I remember when the governor at that time, Governor George Wallace, he had just been elected governor of the state, I think earlier that year, and there were 2 students who were matriculating at, I think it's Alabama State.
The University of Alabama.
University of Alabama,
Yes, sir.
right. Vivian Malone and James Hood. And I watched him stand in front of the door, and he gave a speech, and he would not let them enter. They had to be, the National Guard, I think, had to let them come through. And I wondered, and I asked God, Teddy, after seeing such animosity and such hatred of people who looked like me, black like me,
Right.
colored, we used to say at that time, why people in the larger society hated us so. And I couldn't reconcile that because the Bible that I grew up with, even at a young age, made it plain that we're all brothers. We're all brothers and sisters. And so I asked God at that moment, why did he make me a Negro? I'm not 7 years old yet.
7, right. Not even
And
7.
I'm asking God this kind of question. And I think this book, the writing of this book, is part of the answer to that.
Well, that's great because you eventually move out of Mobile, Alabama. And where do you go after Mobile, Alabama? Where do you settle, rather?
Right. Now, this was in the 60s.
Right.
So we're talking about some very crazy times. We were going through the Civil Rights Movement. You had Martin and Malcolm, and you had the Vietnam War. You had the flower power, and all of these things were going on. So we left, my mother remarried, and we left Mobile, Alabama, and family and everything that we knew, and we moved to Alexandria, Virginia.
Up here in the DMV.
Right, in the DMV. So this was 1966 when we moved here.
Wow. Was it a culture shock to move? Because in a way, Virginia is kind of the South, but it's really like not that much the South. So you're moving from Mobile to Alexandria. Was it culture shock?
Not just culture shock, it was just a trauma, in fact, because my family was in Mobile. We were located within 4 blocks of each other. and we had a large family. So most of my family was right there. When we moved to Virginia, it was just myself, my mother, and some of the family that she brought with her from Mobile. So it was a dramatic change. My grandmother had just died recently, so that was also a trauma. So being uprooted from family, from school, from friends, and moving to a different area was traumatic. One thing kind of was similar, though. We were still in a predominantly black neighborhood in Alexandria.
Okay.
Right.
Do you eventually move to D.C.? Southeast D.C. I read in the book, one of my favorite parts is the relationship of a place that you call, and I'm going to quote you,
Right.
2204.
Right.
Now,
2204.
for our bougie friends, that's 2204. It was the street address of your neighbor, of your street, of your home
Right.
in D.C. Tell me about 2204.
Well, when we moved initially from Alexandria, we moved to Southeast DC, and it was predominantly white at that time.
Really, Southeast?
Southeast.
Really?
We were, in fact, were the second African-American family in that little couple 4-block radius that we knew of. So our neighbors, our immediate neighbors on all sides were white. And our Baptist church at that time, which was a few blocks down, was also predominantly white. So when we moved here, we also moved with some of our family.
Okay.
Because it was an opportunity to leave Alabama and to come up here to go to school. And
So some of your extended family.
extended family came with us. And in fact, we had quite a few of our extended family came. My cousin, who my mom was her oldest, probably dearest cousin at the time. They were only like 6 days apart. And so he came up, my uncle, 2 cousins, our dog. So we had a good nucleus.
Did you have a big house? How did all these people fit in this house?
The good thing is, no, we didn't. We had
Okay.
a small house. And the thing was, we had a merry-go-round of family coming to the house on a regular basis. We had cousins,
Right.
first cousins. My mom had nephews who were nieces who went to Howard University, came to get an education. So when we migrated to the area, so did a lot of our family. And they all stayed with us. Now, my mom also had my brother, Ulysses, and my brother, Willie. And so she would also have to get family as well as people to babysit and keep them while she had to go to work.
Wow. Now, in this neighborhood, I know that you had an eclectic friend base. Talk to me about how your friend group came about, because I know that there's lots of denominations, religions, all types of stuff in your friend group.
Right, and that's very, when you're young like that and families are kind of thrown together, because remember, there was the white flight, and so a lot of black migration took place at that time. And so I had friends that some came from similar backgrounds. I had a very close friend, Chris Jenkins, also a comic book collector, and he and his sister lived right across the street. My immediate next door neighbor, and he was a Baptist at that time. My immediate next door neighbor was of German descent. His name was Eddie Davis, and he was Episcopalian.
Okay.
And his family, which is sort of like a mixed Catholic. We had a very dynamic poet down the street. His name was Palmer Botts, and they were more into yoga and meditation and what have you. So we had that mix. We had another friend who became a black Muslim. He was also recruited by John Thompson because he was an excellent basketball player. His name was Stuart Cooper. And so we had just a very ecumenical framework in the neighborhood. And the thing about it is, though, we all got along because we all were searching. One of the key things about our friendships and that time dynamic, is that racism was always part of the headlines. It was always this struggle back and forth. And it was a lot of, in our culture, a lot of black power, so to speak.
Sure, even amongst those different
Yes.
groups, it was all aimed towards the liberation
Yes,
of the
exactly.
African living here in this
Exactly.
country. Got it.
Because remember, some of our heroes were not just Malcolm, but Muhammad Ali and Lou Alcindor at the time, which later became the basketball.
Kareem Abdul-Jabbar.
Kareem
Yes,
Abdul. You had Jim Brown.
Right, Jim Brown.
So you had all of these people that we looked up to and we admired.
Right.
And wanted to emulate.
And they were strong men of African descent
That's
who
right.
stood on their own 2 feet.
That's right.
And so you guys, were you searching to be just like them in that regard spiritually?
Not necessarily as much as spiritually, but as vocal, yes.
Okay.
As the Black Power movement really had taken hold in our community. And so we really looked up to those guys and wanted to emulate them. You know, I remember how they walked, for example. And although people wouldn't say it, we would practice our pimp, as it was called back in that day.
With a limp.
Right?
Of course.
Right. So, yes, those were some very dynamic times.
Right. Now, you're searching for truth, but eventually Aunt Annie Mae comes to the DMV.
Right.
And she becomes very impactful on your life spiritually. How so?
Aunt Annie Mae was a no-nonsense Southern bred and born and bred woman. She was light-skinned, and she had encountered racism. She was born, I think, 1915, so she'd encountered racism the majority of her life. And Alabama, by the way, was a staunchly racist community.
Sure.
All right. And so she came to visit her younger sister, who happened to be my mother, Gwendolyn Wood. And this particular summer she came up was a seminal time in my life because I was in high school concerned about my future. Where would I go to college, if I would go to college, and just my direction in life. Because, you know, in that age, you're kind of uncertain. And in the neighborhood and culture that I grew up in, you know, it was not cool to be smart, so to speak.
Sure.
And so I'm concerned about those things. And they're kind of in the back of my head. But Aunt Annie Mae took me aside one Sabbath. I'd gone to church with her. At that point, it was DuPont Park. Didn't really know about Sabbath. And we began to talk after church. And she asked me, you know, how I liked church. And my first impression with the church was I liked it because of the young people there. And they were different in a way I just couldn't put my hand to. And so I liked the church. It was a big church, much bigger than my Baptist church at that time. And so she began to tell me this remarkable story. Now, I was into comic books, and I had the biggest comic book collection in my neighborhood. And she began to tell me this story about the battle between good and evil.
What did she call that in particular? Did it have like a term or a name?
Yes.
What was it?
It did, Teddy. It was called the Great Controversy.
So it's the battle between good and evil.
The Great Controversy.
How did, as a comic book dude, how did that catch your attention?
Oh, man, it fell right in line with everything that I had grown to love. You know, the good guys, the bad guys. Like with Westerns, I grew up loving Westerns. And so that could have jumped right out of the pages of the Fantastic Four, Thor,
Superman.
All
of
right.
them have a kind of good, evil type of foundation.
Exactly,
Yeah,
exactly
many of
right,
them.
exactly.
Right.
And so for me, as she told me about what was going to happen, okay, and she told me with a certainty that was infectious. And I was mesmerized by the whole, her whole story. And she told me that Jesus, okay, was coming again. And before he came, the world would be in a state much like it is right now. You'd have pestilence and famine. Sure. You'd have shootings and murders. You'd have just turmoil.
Right.
And And then it just got my attention. And then she said there would come a time when God's people would be persecuted because they believed in the seventh-day Sabbath.
And you've never heard that
I never
before,
heard
right.
of the 7 days. Her church was different because it was on the Sabbath, on the seventh day, but I never thought anything else about it other than that. And so she elaborated on that, and she told me that she got me spellbound, that in those last times, everybody in the world will turn against God's people. And that, but at the very a time that they were coming to kill, to exterminate God's people, Christ would come back.
As a Superman to save his people.
To save his people, that's exactly right.
What did you decide to do with that information?
I was just dumbfounded. I wanted to know more. So she promised to give me the book, and she did. And at that point, I began to research and search. I began to go into learning myself. And fortunately, at that time, my last year of high school, I got a teacher, and his name happened to be Jacob Justice.
Okay.
He had been he was an Adventist minister, and actually he had been the minister at DuPont Park Church years before. And so he took up the baton, so to speak. I remember my first day in his class at Anacostia High School. Went through his class, and there were, a good number of students there, and he taught African American history.
Okay.
And this is what he did. He introduced himself, and he picked up the history book. He read the first page of the first chapter of the history book. He shut the history book, looked at all of the students, and said, "Everything I just read is a lie." And he threw the history book into the trash can.
So I'm sure he became one of your heroes.
He was a hero right off the bat.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yes. So he encouraged me to begin to do my own research, and told me a lot of things. And ultimately, I would end up going to the church that he went to.
Do you eventually become a Seventh-day Adventist as a teenager?
Yes, I do. My last year in high school, and this was kind of like the capstone. A friend of mine and I, Daniel Botts, who was the
poet, right?
His dad was the poet, and he was he would eventually go to India, pick up Hinduism, and that kind of thing. And he and I went to see The Exorcist. It had just come out the week before, so we caught the bus, went up to Georgetown. It was on Wisconsin Avenue. It was winter, I think the first week in January. And he and I went to see the movie, and we couldn't get in. So we stayed outside and in the parking lot. It was cold because it was wintertime, and we smoked a couple of joints on somebody's car who we didn't know. Okay? And so we went to the movie, and we were lit, as they used to say.
Buzzed up a little bit.
Exactly. And got into the movie, and we watched it, and we laughed all the way through the movie.
I can just imagine a high teenager watching The Exorcist. That is fun, I'm sure, on some level.
It was. The thing was, though, Teddy, we sat through it a second time. The buzz had worn off.
Yeah.
And I looked at that movie and said, wow, the devil is real.
Right. Which was in line with what Aunt Annie Mae was teaching you. The great controversy is real. This is not a game.
It's not a game.
So you eventually become a Seventh-day Adventist as a teenager. How does that affect your flow with your friends that are, ecumenical on many levels?
Right.
How does that affect them?
Good question. I couldn't turn around at that point. I was vested into my belief, and the Holy Spirit was really working in me. And so I began to evangelize my neighborhood.
Okay.
I began to knock on doors, pass out tracts, and you name it in the neighborhood, I began to do it. And my boys, so to speak, gave me a nickname. They called me the Rev.
Okay.
But it was, to them it was funny, but to me, I was serious, and that was
Yeah.
okay.
Because you were on fire.
I was on fire for the Lord. I was on fire for the Lord. And it was shortly thereafter that I began, like I said, evangelizing the neighborhood and decided that I wanted to go into essentially the ministry.
Okay.
All right. And so I heard about the school in Tacoma Park, Columbia Union College, and I went there. And that was my first introduction to pretty much a predominantly white school. But prior to that, I had been in mostly predominantly black schools.
Listen, thank you for watching. We're at the half point of the interview right now. Just want to take the time to point you to Nathaniel's website. The website is www.hisglorypublishing.com. And if you go to that website, you will see the ways that you can purchase the book. You'll also see important information about Nathaniel Arnold's ministry that God has given to him, where he's trying to get people to understand the spiritual struggle between good and evil, not just in his life, but in your life and in mine. And he's trying to get us to choose Jesus Christ to help us through that struggle, so that not only will we be in the kingdom of heaven and doing what God expects us to do, but that we will not be deceived or lost, and that we will be an effective witness for Jesus Christ to help bring others to the light. So after this interview, we have about another half left to go. If you will go to his website, you'll see it on the screen, or you've already seen it on the screen. And he has so much great information. He wants you to contact him as well. And I think he'll speak to that by the end of this interview. Thank you for watching the first half of this interview. Stick around, stay with us, and you'll get more of this great information from Nate. And by God's grace, you'll be inspired to choose Jesus Christ in your life as well. Thank you.
So let's get to that, because remember, you grow up in the paradigm of religion and race.
Right.
Now you're into religion heavily, or theology heavily, and now you're about to get back into race heavily, or into different ethnicities.
Right.
Tell me about your experience, because not only did you go to Columbia Union College, but you also went to Oakwood College.
Exactly right.
Columbia Union College is now Washington Adventist University, and Oakwood College is now Oakwood University. Tell us about your experiences there and how it affected you in terms of your faith.
Gladly. It was a difficult transition in the sense that I was a new convert, had never really experienced the Adventist, quote, lifestyle, so to speak. So there were a lot of adjustments for me. And I had one foot in one world, another foot in another. And so as I went to CUC, because of my grades in high school, they put me on academic probation. But I did very well, because my last year in high school I did well. And so I had to kind of prove myself, both as in a scholarly situation, as well as just in a new environment with new friends and all of that. But one thing that I really was distraught about was the sameness, so to speak, of the racial issue that I had known had been such a problem in my life. I suspected, I hoped that in the Adventist culture that racism would not be as entrenched as it had been in our dominant culture. But yet I found that it was, and that was very disappointing to me.
So by sameness, you're saying that the people outside the church, in terms of bigotry and prejudice, acted the same way as some of the people inside of the church.
Yes, that's exactly right. And again, that was difficult for me to deal with, because I expected differently from God's church and God's people who had his last day message.
Right. So you eventually go to Oakwood College.
Right.
How does that turn out?
Oakwood, I found, was a beautiful experience, even though it was short for me. And so my expectations were really high. But I found a lot of the same similarities in culture. My expectations were different, but we had the same problems because we're the same people.
Okay.
Okay.
Now, Oakwood, I should add, it's an HBCU.
Exactly.
Predominantly black,
Right.
historically black college university.
Right.
So I wouldn't have expected you, I don't think you had bigotry issues there.
No, didn't.
Okay,
Didn't have
so-
that. But what I found was that you still had issues that dealt with trying to find out who you were, more internal kinds of things, and
Sure.
where do I fit in this world
Right.
kind of thing.
Because wherever there are people, there is going to be caste.
Exactly.
There is going to be cliques and all of that stuff. Got
Exactly.
it. You eventually go back to
see-
Columbia Union
right,
College.
So you see, right.
How does that go? You're like on a slingshot of
Exactly.
different- So how does that go?
In my book, I say that the marriage with Adventism, the honeymoon with Adventism was over. Now it was a marriage. I was beginning to see firsthand issues that religion can bring about in a church and in an individual life. Mm-hmm. And so I had to really at that time grapple because I felt that I changed majors. I left religion theology.
Didn't want to mess with theology
No,
anymore.
not.
Okay.
I couldn't deal with it, and I chose psychology to help me kind of understand the dissonance that I was feeling in my religious life, in my real world life, and maybe that's not the best term, but there was this disconnect.
Sure.
That I had to have resolved because race had been and religion had been so prominent in my life all my life that I could no longer just deal with it. So when I came back and I changed my major to psychology, I decided to do my practicum, okay, on race and religiosity. Mm-hmm. I wanted to find out if there was a correlation between a person's religious beliefs and their attitude about race.
Okay.
And so I began to do the research for that. I developed a series of
Like surveys,
questionnaires,
right?
surveys,
Yeah.
right.
Like you were doing your own Gallup poll.
Exactly.
I read in the book that you literally were on the campus and you would just walk up to people of different ethnicities,
Exactly.
predominantly white probably,
Yes,
and just
yes.
ask them straight up. And they would give you what you believe to be
Right.
straight up answers.
Answers,
How'd
right.
that go?
One of my most poignant interviews, and I also talk about this in the book, was with this young white woman who had matriculated with me. She was a freshman. Mm-hmm. And the reason I chose her is because she was like, I think from Ohio, somewhere in kind of rural, mid-America. And in particular, though, we had come to school together, but I never, Teddy, remember her actually speaking to me, okay? Or for that matter, even any black students. And so I wanted to talk to her in particular. And so we actually met. Now, I don't know if it was my suggestion or hers, but in broad daylight, in the front of the campus, at the where the flagpoles are.
Sure.
And as I listened to her respond to the survey, it was amazing to me how she disconnected what she was saying from me. It's almost as if she were talking about me and people that looked like me in the third person, that we really were not human beings.
Wow.
And that was, I just felt that was just so amazing to me to experience that.
Right. I'm sure that disheartened you. Well, if I recall correctly, your total results of the survey were disheartening.
Yes.
Because it showed that people that claimed to be religious
Right.
really did have bigoted views
Right.
of other people of other ethnicities.
Right.
And so does that cause you to leave the church eventually?
It was one of the reasons, yes, one of the reasons why headed out the door.
And let me go backwards. Before then, before you did the survey, how would you have defined your relationship with Jesus Christ?
At that point, I would say searching again. I was searching again.
So the fire from your initial conversion,
Right.
what would we say, 17, 18?
Right.
Dwindled down to maybe a flicker of a flame?
Right.
Is that fair to say?
Yes, I would say so.
Okay, so the survey comes now. Is the flame just the little flicker? Is it extinguished?
It's close to extinguished, but let me point out that that's always the devil's plan, to get you to look away from Jesus, to get you to look at other individuals, and to look at yourself.
And it sounds like that's what you were doing.
Exactly.
You were so hurt that people didn't behave as you thought that they
Exactly.
should, when all the time as Christians we're supposed to have our eyes fixed
Exactly, on Christ.
on Christ. Well said.
Right, and so that was the devil's, again, that was the enemy's plan. And so as I looked away from Christ, I saw the sins of the people, including my own. And there was a quote that I read from one of the founding members of our church that I disagreed with. And that was, to me, the last straw. I said, this is no different than what I grew up with. And so I began to find excuses for my apostasy.
Right. So you eventually break out from your association with the church. You're a young adult.
Right.
You've graduated from college.
Exactly.
I believe you started working on your master's.
Yes.
Eventually, you're married to a beautiful woman, and because of time, Cassandra, forgive us, we don't have time to talk about your lovely courtship and all of that stuff. But you're eventually married to Cassandra, the beautiful Cassandra, and you're at DuPont Park Adventist Church again for a baby blessing.
Yes,
for
of my oldest daughter.
For your oldest daughter.
Right.
You hear a sermon. Tell me about that sermon.
That was another pivotal point in my life. The minister, I don't remember his face well. I remember the event, but I remember the sermon. He spoke about racism and the church and Christianity in a way I had never heard it spoken about before. Social justice, but it was more than just a social justice message. It was something I could relate to. And so I took that sermon and said, wow, this brings back to me the fire that I once felt about in the 60s in the civil rights movement. And so I decided I was going to really find out about what he was saying about black history and black world history, and how we were not just the people that were, our history went way before America. And some of the things that Elder Jacob Justice also told me as well. And so I became a voracious reader of Pan-African literature. And so I learned a lot about African history and diaspora.
And so from this learning, it's your reinvigoration to back at 2204. Right? And now you decide to write. You learn so much that you decide to write your own book. Can you tell me about your first book?
Exactly. I had intended, I wanted to write a book even in college, but I just never felt I had enough experience. But I remember, again, going back to television, I remember watching Rodney King being beaten to a pulp by 4 white police officers. And I wondered, what would it take to stop this kind of abuse in this country? And so that gave me the impetus and the thought of what kind of book I would write. So I began to write. I told my brother-in-law, Dennis Smith, I was going to write a book. I told others as well, but nobody believed me but Dennis. And so I made the effort to begin to write a book. The book would be called The Genocide Files.
What was the Genocide Files about?
The Genocide Files was about a young black man, Matthew Peterson, who didn't really know his culture. And he had been brought up in an environment where he was matriculated in mostly white schools. And he, with the help of of a very dynamic black woman, Iwanike Briscoe, who is just the opposite, polar opposites, they come across this group called Triangle. All right. Triangle is based much as on the slave triangle, Brazil, Africa, and the Americas. And it's a group whose sole purpose is to take back their culture, their lives, and to take it by any means necessary. And so they murder a police officer and his family who had been involved in the murder of a black activist years before. So it's a retribution murder, revenge murder.
And so just let me interject. This is a book of fiction.
It's fiction,
right?
Correct.
So it's an incredible story,
right,
that your readers dove into, and it became a cult-followed book.
Exactly.
It had a great following, if I recall correctly, even in prisons,
right,
on campuses.
Right.
And how do you get relief from writing this book? Do you get a sense of freedom, a sense of liberation from writing this book?
All of that and more. But let me say that the book was actually banned in certain federal prisons.
Okay.
They would not let it in. But I have several stories, true stories, about my experience with the book. And one is I was doing a book signing here in Prince George's County at a bookstore in Oxon Hill at the time. And while I was there and giving the story, reading, excerpts from the book and that kind of thing, a young man approached me and the bookstore owner, and he introduced himself. And he told me in no uncertain terms, said, "You have a great book." And he worked for the ATF, by the way, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and explosives. And he said, "You have a great book, but you need to be careful." He said, because this book, The Genocide Files, has a grassroots appeal. And because of that, you're on a watch list, okay? Now, I tried to shrug this off, but he made an impression. And Hakeem, who owned the bookstore at that time, told me about his story as a black Muslim. He was a black Muslim, and how when he first came into the black Muslims, Islam, that he was also put on a watch list. Wow. And couldn't get a government job after that.
Wow. So you were deep into Afrocentricity at this time, the Pan-African movement,
right,
the pro-black movement.
Right.
And are you finding a sense of healing, though? Because remember, Aunt Annie Mae taught you about the great controversy between good and evil.
Right.
You pursued it. You were hurt by the people that you interacted with within the faith.
Right.
And so is this providing the healing from that hurt that you experienced?
Yes, to a degree.
Okay.
And I have to qualify that because there was still something missing. Mm-hmm. Okay. The Afrocentric movement, Pan-Africanism, has a lot of positives. Okay. But it holds out a promise that it really cannot fulfill. Okay. Knowing your culture is one thing, and who you are, and that's paramount to a lot of people. But there's a hurt that we have inside that goes beyond that, and only God can feel that. And so, yes, it helped, but I also noticed about the movement that it had a lot of parallels, a lot of similarities with other things.
Like what?
Meditation and yoga. And you name it, it has a lot of the good vibes and the good feelings and karma and all of those things. And because of what was going on in my life, I was first diagnosed with cancer in 2000. I began to look at holistic approaches. I began to look at yoga. I began to look at meditation. And all of those things, Teddy, had one thing in common that I also knew from experience, And that was it had an animosity toward Christianity.
And you noticed that.
And I noticed that. So it was like all of these, like all of these things piling up against this one. And the only reason you do that, like in football, because you got the ball. Okay? The person who has the ball, that's who everybody's after. And so when I began to understand that all of these things were against Christ and Christianity, I began to look at it in a different way.
See, this is odd to me because even though Christ historically is a Middle Eastern or North African, spent time in North Africa, Christianity is seen as a European religion.
Right, it is.
And so do you think that could have been why there was so much animosity towards Christ from that movement, from Afrocentricity, Pan-Africanism?
I think to some degree that is the case, but I really think the real reason is because of the hypocrisy.
The hypocrisy of the Christians.
Of the Christians, right.
Okay.
Because I think that really is, and we as Seventh-day Adventists have a very unique perspective on that. Our church was formed in 1863 as in the midst of the Civil War. So racism and religion has a very prominent place in our history as well, as it did mine.
I see.
And so because I think, the Civil War not only tore this country apart, but it tore the religions of this country apart. That's why you have the Southern Baptists. That's why you have the Southern Methodists. They weren't all Southern at the time. They were one denomination. And so we see that race has played a large part in the formation of the country in both a civil way as well as a civil way as well as a religious way.
Now, because of time, I have to kind of skip through. Your book details a lot of the experiences that you went through. And I just want to cut to it because eventually you develop a dislike, or you become less enthralled with the Afrocentric movement.
Right.
What causes you to be ultimately unattracted to the Afrocentric movement?
Several things. As I said, the Afrocentric movement holds out a promise of self-discovery, of purpose that it really can't fulfill. And one of the reasons why I say it can't fulfill is because I began to talk to my elders in the movement. And I began to see their, what's the word I want to use? Their frustration, their inability to realize their goals. And when you look at people like Malcolm and Martin, and the list goes on and on and on, people who live their lives fighting the battle, only to never be any closer to the goal. And so I began to sense that. I began to see that. And as I talked to people who I had come across meeting in the book, the frustration that they had, I didn't want to go down that same path. And because of my religious background, I began to look again at what I had left before, because I had known that wholeness before.
Right. So this brings us back to the great controversy. Right. Because Aunt Annie Mae introduced you to it. Your life from that point to your adulthood now is probably in your mid-30s when you, or I don't even know, 40s maybe.
The 40s by the time.
Right. So now you lose your attraction to the movement. You understand that you're not being fulfilled. But how do you see the great controversy playing out in your journey, starting with Christ as a 17-year-old, eventually experiencing people, the real world, and then losing an attraction to Christ, and now coming back to Christ? Where's the great controversy in that?
It was always a part of it. It was always a part of it. One thing I've learned, Teddy, is that the struggle is a daily struggle. We all struggle with something. If we struggle with complacency, if we struggle with trying to find ourselves, it's always a struggle. And so my struggle is part and parcel of, I think, the largest struggle that I've been a witness to all my life, and it helps me to put it into a different context. I can see the struggle of America that I see in myself. I can see the disappointments that many people have with where this country is and where they feel it's going. But ultimately, I learned that, again, I can't take my eyes off of Christ. Because the moment you do, the moment you begin to look at those things around you, you forget your purpose. Because you can only find your purpose in Christ. And that's the message that I've learned through all of this.
Now, this is a 3-part book series.
Right.
So we're only talking about book 1, and we're leaving off pretty much where book 1 kind of leaves off.
Right.
But I encourage the reader, please, the listener, please get the book. You'll get to see the intricacies of the experiences that you went through and how God's hand moved or was with you, even when you were trying to go away from God. But this is what I want you to do as we end. If you'll look in your specific camera over my shoulder, I want you to speak to the person that is going through what you've gone through, and they're still on that journey, but they haven't yet found the Christ that you have found.
Right.
And the answer to the journey and to all the frustrations that you spoke about. Please encourage them of what they should do to find the peace and the fulfillment and the purpose that they're looking for.
Thanks, Teddy. That's a big one. I think that it's important for you, the reader of my book, to understand that first, God loves you. No matter where you are, no matter where you have been, no matter what you've done, God loves you, and He is there to pull you out of whatever situation you find yourself in. You may have gone down wrong paths, you may have done things that you can't even tell people about, but God already knows. And if you ask Him, if you seek Him, and that's one of the things that I did, I never stopped praying. If you ask God to give you guidance, if you ask God to give you help, He will do that. He's promised to do it. And feel free to reach out to myself or to Teddy, because we're here to share our testimony and to help people just like you to come to God, because the time is short and the enemy is real. The great controversy is real. And unless you begin to understand it's real in your life, you will be lost.
Well, that's the end of the interview. Thank you very much. Please subscribe, like, and share. Go to the website. It's on the screen right now. There's more information about the book and about the ministry. Nate, thank you so much for stopping by and sharing your testimony. God bless you. God bless you all. Take care.